In 1981, a group of archaeology students from Sheffield University were granted temporary permission to explore one of Yorkshire's most forgotten sites, the village of Ashworth. No one actually lived there anymore. Not after the 1965 incident. Not after the Higgins family disappeared without a trace and the entire village seemed to cease to exist on the map. Ashworth, now barely a name on the records, was once a small, peaceful community where St. Mary's Church stood in the middle of an ancient stone square, surrounded by a bakery, a library, a pharmacy, and a clock tower that had been defunct since 1966. The students, 6 in all, had brought with them maps, cameras, some land surveying equipment, and of course, the curiosity that only youth can bring to places where adults advise against entering. They camped in the only partially intact brick and stone house, 19 Quaint Street, once the Warren family home. According to old records, the last owner of the house was Mr. Jacob Warren, a skilled clockmaker who looked after the village's famous old tower clock. It was said that he had lived alone after his young niece disappeared for unknown reasons in the winter of 1966. No body was found, no clues were found. The girl was named Elspeth. During the first 2 days, the archaeological team recorded the structure of the house, picked up a few old newspaper pages, some broken ceramics, a local map so damp that the date could not be seen. But on the third night, while the team was examining the floor behind the kitchen, one of them, a student named Margaret, accidentally stepped on a hollow brick that made an unusual sound. After clearing away the ash and removing the rotten wood, they discovered a subterranean chamber of stone sealed with sand and dry clay. Inside they found a small square wooden chest covered with a resin that had hardened like amber. And inside the chest was a faded suede diary. On the cover were engraved words, not in ink, but in small, handcrafted metal letters. Elspeth. The last year. None of the group immediately realized the importance of the diary. In fact, they almost glanced at it, thinking it was just a notebook of someone who had been hiding in the house after the war. But that night, Margaret, who had found the chest, decided to read it alone. The girl, a student of religious history, did not leave the living room but sat by the candlelight, turning the pages of the rough, musty-smelling paper and reading as if someone were whispering instructions right into her neck. And here was the first entry in the diary, written in light brown ink in the steady hand of a well-practiced person. His clock tower lied, but he no longer had the strength to make it silent. So he taught me to listen to the truth through its ticking. If I don't write it down, I'll forget. If I forget, I'll become part of it. And if I become part of it, Ashworth will have no observer. The following pages opened up a world that none of the students could have imagined. Another Ashworth, not a peaceful village, but a machine driven by ritual, blood, and time. Elspeth, at the age of 8, began to write down what she saw and heard after accidentally witnessing a ritual taking place in the middle of the night, right under the church floor, where people had always thought there was only cold earth and blue stone. You might think that children would imagine ghosts when they were trapped in a sleepy village, but Elspeth didn't imagine. She wrote. She wrote as a witness. And when you hear the next part, you'll wonder, how did a child know the exact date, time, and name of every person who disappeared from Ashworth? Before they disappeared, Elspeth Warren was born in 1953 in a village no one wanted to leave, and no one was allowed to leave. Her mother died in a difficult birth. Her father disappeared a few months later on his way back from York. No body, no funeral. Her grandfather, Jacob Warren, a silent watchmaker, took her in. He didn't hold her, he didn't sing her to sleep like people do to babies. Instead, he taught her to listen. At first, there were small sounds. The click of a second hand, the snap of a spring, the dry click of a hinge. Then, there were invisible sounds, the clatter of two watches of the same style, the strangled sound of a worn gear, and what he called the breath of time breaking. Elspeth didn't understand, but she spent hours in the wood shop behind the house watching her grandfather toil with magnifying glasses, tweezers, oil, and numbers. It was not until she was 7 that he let her touch a real clock, not to fix it, but to hear if it was sad or angry. And then he took her to the clock tower in the middle of the village, a place few people cared about after the 1950s. That tower, taller than the roof of St. Mary's, had stood there since the 16th century. And in his words, it was the heart of Ashworth. Not just because it kept time, but because it kept memories. Elspeth first climbed to the top of the tower on a misty winter morning. Downstairs was the engine room, heavy ropes, huge gears, and a cast iron block he called the purification door. Not everyone gets to see it, he said. Not everyone should know. But you are the last one. That night, Elspeth woke in the middle of the night to the sound of the bell. The tower clock only chimed on time, but it was 2:17 a.m. No one had adjusted the bells at that time. She quietly got out of bed, put on her dressing gown, and walked down the wooden corridor and the back door toward the church. There, in the dim moonlight, she saw a group of people in long cloaks entering St. Mary's. No sound, no lights. But what Elspeth could not forget, among those who entered were the village doctor, the schoolmaster, and the baker from whom she often bought waffles. Elspeth did not dare to go in, but she knew that under the church floor, there was another floor. Grandfather had said, "Never go down before you are old enough. Once you go down, you can't come back." The girl stood in the dark for nearly 20 minutes, listening. And then she heard a knock. 3 times. Slow, cold, crack, crack, crack. It wasn't a church bell. It was a clock striking out of tune. Elspeth returned home without telling her grandfather. But he knew. The next morning, he placed a blank sheet of paper and a marker in front of her and said, "You saw. Now you start writing it down. Because when everyone forgets, only you will remember." In the diary, found in 1981, that was the first entry written in detail. Not about feelings, not about fear, about time, about the names of the people present that night, about the sound of footsteps on the church steps. Elspeth recorded as if she were a living clock, meant to remember, not to be moved. Elspeth had seen the first ceremony, but it was not the last. For under the cold stone floor of the church, there were still doors that no one had ever opened. And one day, her grandfather disappeared after leaving behind a clock without a hand. In March 1964, Mr. Jacob Warren, the last clockmaker in Ashworth, disappeared. There was no funeral, no obituary. The villagers simply said He's an old man. He must have gone back to his wife and children. Elspeth was 11. She knew better. The night before he disappeared, he had left her a small silver watch wrapped in a blue velvet box. No hour hand, no minute hand, just a strange hand that turned backward slowly. And not according to any unit of time she had ever learned. When this hand stands still, he had said, "Go to the church and step down." 3 days after he disappeared, the hand stopped moving. That night, Elspeth left the house with a candle in her hand, the watch in her coat pocket, and a loose sheet of paper. No one noticed. The village was used to children wandering about, but no one went down into the underground chambers of St. Mary's. Except for a few, Elspeth had noted down. St. Mary's, without the lights, looked like an ancient stone ship buried at sea. The stone statues were worn, the pulpit was dusty, and the echo of each footstep sounded as if someone were following her. Behind the main altar there was a low wooden door, usually covered by a carpet. But Elspeth knew. Her grandfather had left a mark, a small hand-carved sundial-shaped gash in the left corner of the altar. She fumbled with the latch and descended the spiral stone staircase. There was no light, no moonlight, only the damp smell of time and a strong metallic smell, like dried blood, rust, and old. In the basement, Elspeth saw white-clothed figures, long as people lying parallel along the corridor. To the left were walls engraved with words, a language she had never studied but had seen in her grandfather's books. In the center of the basement was a large horizontal clock, circular with the 12 signs of the zodiac engraved around the edge, and in the center was a lock with an O symbol, the symbol of the end. She touched the clock and felt it was beating. It did not turn. It did not make a sound, but it was beating like a heart locked in stone. Elspeth wrote on a piece of paper, "The clock breathes, but it does not measure time. It counts souls." Behind the clock was a small, discreet room where candlelight reflected charcoal drawings, hooded figures standing in a circle of 12 childish silhouettes. Above it were the words, "Those who remember cannot be saved. Those who forget may pass through the gate." Elspeth began to understand that the ritual was no ordinary sacrifice. It was a time loop where the chosen children had to become the bearers of memories or be erased and become the keepers of the ritual for the next generation. One remembered, one forgot. One stood outside the circle. One was in the center. "You chose me to remember," she wrote in her diary. "But if I remember for too long, will I still be human?" When Elspeth left the basement, she was not afraid. She felt cold. And when she left the church, she saw a light in the second-floor window of the house where the Higgins family had lived, the house that had been abandoned since the previous winter. There was someone in there. There was a tiny lullaby. From that night on, Elspeth stopped writing. She began to draw. The pictures were like spiritual maps leading to where the children would disappear. And then, just a few weeks later, the Higgins family was told they had left the village to go on a trip. But Elspeth knew they never left. Nurse Josephine, a middle-aged woman who had worked at an orphanage in suburban Ashburn, reported that she had been haunted by the same dreams for years beginning in the winter of 1913, the exact season Emma Richter disappeared. In those dreams, she entered a room filled with a dim blue light, a light that did not come from the moon or any other human-made light source. In the center of the room was a round table, covered with old parchment black ink, and numbers running down it like a meaningless string. But what frightened Josephine most was the little girl sitting in the corner of the table. Emma, still Emma, not a bit older, not changed, not blinking. The little girl kept staring at Josephine, then put her index finger to her mouth, as if to say shh, to be quiet. Every time Josephine woke up, she was filled with a nameless anxiety. And every time she did, she checked the file cabinet at the orphanage where she had recorded the girls with special signs. There was a file locked away marked with a red thread. And the name on that file, of course, was Emma R. Josephine didn't know how she got it. She didn't remember ever seeing Emma when she worked there. But the handwriting on the file was her own. The dates matched. The last note made her shudder every time she read it. Do not let her come into contact with other children when the moon is waning, especially on March 27th. Why no explanation? No supervisor's name on the file. No seal of approval from the institution. Josephine had considered burning the file, but as she lit the fire, an unusually strong wind blew the papers away. She saw amid the unburned ashes a handwritten note in silvery grey ink. "You're still here." A month later, Josephine received an unsent envelope, unpostmarked, unsigned. Just a single page handwritten. "Don't look any further. We tried to reconcile, but the girl is not something to be reconciled to. We did everything we could. But memory cannot be erased when it is written in logic." Josephine moved out of Milwaukee that same week. Listener, have you ever dreamed of a room you've never been in, but you know exactly what's inside? Have you ever had a dream that left you feeling like you'd left someone in your own house? If so, you've probably seen the girl. Lillian Van Schuyler died in 1989 at the age of 94. She died in her sleep in the house where she had lived for nearly 7 decades. After a private funeral, the Van Schuyler house was never put up for sale. No family came forward to claim it. The house was placed in the care of the city and then left vacant. Yet, throughout the 1990s, strange reports came in from neighbors and city employees assigned to inspect the property. They said that on fall afternoons, when fog blanketed the hills of Newburyport, lights would flicker in the attic, a place long thought to be sealed off. A maintenance worker named Marcus Walcott recalled being assigned to check the house's electrical system in 1996. He had no intention of going into the attic. The main electrical panel was in the basement. But as he climbed the stairs to check the electrical outlet on the second floor, he heard footsteps. Clear, dry, but not hurried. Footsteps directly overhead. The attic, he knew, was nailed shut from the outside with thick oak. There was no way up from the inside. He went outside, climbed a ladder to check the shutters, and saw something that made his blood run cold. Behind the thick layer of dust that covered the tiny glass of the attic window, there was a handprint, small, thin, and with 5 distinct fingers, as if someone had stood inside, pressed against the glass. Marcus left the house without finishing his work. He applied for a transfer just 2 weeks later. The attic was marked inaccessible in city records. But in 2001, a local historical research team was granted access to the house to conduct a survey before listing it as a historic site. And they discovered the stairs to the attic had existed but had been removed, and the walls had been plastered over from inside Lillian's bedroom closet. After much negotiation with the authorities, the team was allowed to remove the wall. And when they did, a strange, cold smell came pouring in from another time. After nearly a century, the stairs to the attic reappeared. The wooden steps were old and warped, but still sturdy enough to climb. The team carried cameras, thermometers, electromagnetic field detectors, as if they were entering an archaeological site rather than a house in the middle of the city. At the top of the stairs, a heavy oak door. It was unlocked, but when pushed open, it felt like it was pushing against an invisible pressure. The room inside was unlike any attic they had ever seen. The walls were lined with faded floral paper, but the repeated rose pattern was still recognizable, identical to the pattern on the old handkerchief Lillian had carried in her purse. On the table was a diary. The last entry dated August 14th, 1934. The writer's name, M. Van Schuyler. But there was no one in the Van Schuyler family tree with a name beginning with M at that time. When they opened the diary, they found the lines slanted, clear, and delicate recording fragments of memories that could not be understood. The voice came back tonight. It said that mother knew but could not help, that the promise to the man in the beaver fur coat must be kept. I did not want to go, but the blood had been taken. I signed my name with the blade of the knife in the cloth box. The last page was torn to shreds, leaving only one word intact: remember. What made things even more chilling was that when they examined the back wall of the attic, they found a crack, and inside was an old charcoal portrait. It was of a teenage girl, her eyes wide, but not looking directly at the viewer. Her hand rested on a book and seemed to be shaking. Below the picture was a handwritten note in French: Elle n'a jamais quitté la chambre. She never left this room. After the attic was explored, the Van Schuyler house was sealed again. The members of the research team agreed not to make the diary publicly available, and only to send excerpts to a select few scholars. But something strange happened to the research team itself. Within 3 years of that expedition, 4 of the 7 men suffered strange events: short-term memory loss, persistent nightmares, and one went missing while walking at night around a lake near Newburyport. No one was sure whether the attic was just an old room or a portal to things humans should not touch. In the days that followed, Edmund and Evangeline lived like shadows inside the Vandermark estate. They did not speak much. What had been revealed in the basement left no room for argument or evasion. The only question that remained was how to escape the siege without being buried with it. Cornelius kept his face impassive, but his eyes were no longer calm. Edmund noticed the fleeting glances, the times Cornelius went down to the basement and came back with his shirt collar slightly askew, the hint of something well hidden. And Evangeline now, whenever he touched her shoulder or called out to her from the hallway, jumped like a hunted animal. One evening in the cold wind, blowing off the Allegheny River, Evangeline discovered an old tunnel behind the coal shed. It had not been used for years, blocked by rotten barrels and rusty chains. But the oil lamp in her hand illuminated the words carved into the stone, claving pro veritate key to the truth. It was no random slogan. Edmund recognized it as the motto used in a secret writing their father had made in his notebook, the one Cornelius had deliberately kept after the funeral. When they opened the tunnel, they found a network of ancient corridors, not for transporting coal as had been assumed, but for moving people secretly. Rotting papers, prison uniforms, small saw blades, prosthetic feet, a little girl's bloody shoe, indisputable evidence of human trafficking, forced labor, and secret executions. Evangeline sat down on the cold stone floor, her head in her hands, unable to breathe. "It's not just corruption," she said, staring into space. "They built an entire kingdom underground." Our father was silenced because he tried to expose it. Edmund did not answer. He was reading a folded piece of paper found in a crevice behind a broken-legged wooden desk. On it was a diagram, not just of this mansion, but of 4 others marked with the same cross-hatched circular symbol, the Pittsburgh Circle. They didn't just exist. They had systems, rules, and distribution networks throughout the industrial states. And Edmund and Evangeline, they had entered the center. In the days that followed, they watched in secret. Cornelius left the house 3 times during the night. Each time without leaving a trace. Each time he returned with mud that was not native to their region. Edmund secretly cut a piece of mud from the heel of his shoe and took it to the small chemistry room that had been used by Mr. Vandermark Sr. The result, red clay from Sharpsburg, where a metal foundry once stood, now abandoned. Evangeline, by installing a small mirror in the airing passage, caught the reflection in Cornelius's study. One night, she watched him open the safe. But what he took out was not money or business documents. It was 3 black and white photographs. The photographs showed 3 men, one in military uniform, one in a doctor's gown, and the third in a priest's robe. On the back of each was a date and a phrase: blood-packed Pittsburgh Obit 1861. When Edmund laid the diagram and the piece of paper on the table, they knew there was no going back. Evangeline asked a simple but leaden question. If we overthrow him, who will believe? And will we live to tell? Edmund said nothing. He lit a lamp, laid the map on the table, and pointed to the last red dot, coal shed number 4, where the tunnels intersected. He simply said, "We don't need to tell. We just need to leave a trail for the right person to find." When the clock struck 2 a.m., the 2 of them quietly left the room. The night wind seemed to block their steps, as if even the air knew they were about to break a taboo that had been kept secret for nearly 30 years. And down below, underground in Pittsburgh, the iron door to the altar of coal began to open. When the man named Arthur was questioned for the 3rd time in the infirmary, his words were no longer as disjointed as before. His eyes were glazed over, but his mouth spoke in connected sentences as if they were coming not from his consciousness, but from some door that had opened inside his mind. She didn't walk into the woods. They brought her in. Arthur repeated it over and over. They? But no one in the village remembered seeing anyone other than the permanent residents. When asked who they were, he whispered. They didn't talk with their mouths, but with clapping sounds. Like dead men's fingers hitting the wood. A young doctor named Meredith, who had recently arrived from Edinburgh, began to record the details of Arthur's account. Soon after, she discovered a chilling detail in the village's old medical records in 1819. Another woman named Cowie, possibly Elizabeth's great-grandmother, had disappeared in a similar manner. When she was found, she was barefoot and clutching a cloth stained with dried blood, but there were no other injuries on her body. In Meredith's personal diary, she wrote, "I believe the fear in this village goes back much further than the recent disappearance. It may be transmitted through the blood or through something underground that they dare not name." That night, Meredith had a dream, a long, damp dream. In the dream, she stood on a cliff with the dark sea at her feet. Below her was an open cave covered with moss and fish bones. A woman in a torn nightgown emerged from the cave. In her hand, she held a piece of cloth, just like the one in the 1819 file. And she cried, not with tears but with a repetitive sound. A place without time should not be named. When Meredith woke up, she found wet mud at the foot of her bed. A few days later, a local archaeological team came to the village invited by the Historical Council to explore the coastal cave structure. But when they arrived, the locals were reluctant to lead the way. The villagers bowed their heads, avoided eye contact, and whispered to each other, "That cave has no entrance unless it chooses to open." Meredith went with the archaeological team. Only 3 returned that night. One was Callum, a bearded tough man who had been a soldier. Yet he returned with his clothes torn, his hands covered in scratches and his mouth unable to speak. The remaining 2 could only say one thing: "We saw cloth, like a shroud, but no one dared touch it." The Coast Guard launched a small investigation, but all reports were blocked by a local heritage watchdog committee whose composition was unknown. From then on, no one was allowed within a 2-mile radius of the cave. Wooden signs were posted, "Geological hazard, do not enter." But the villagers knew the cave had not collapsed. It was just sleeping. That left Meredith. She continued to read through the papers about Elizabeth Cowie. In an unnumbered file, she found a note from a priest named Dunreath, written in 1615, just a year after Elizabeth's disappearance. We should not name it. But the girl, she heard the rhythm of the rock. She knew where we had dug. Her blood was enough to open it. How long before the crack opened again? You might be thinking these are metaphors or old coastal superstitions. But sometimes, the longer you live with a fear, the more you learn to avoid naming it. River Asylum Hospital, December 1855. The last days of the year brought a biting cold, creeping into every crack in the ancient brick walls. Snow fell for 3 nights in a row, covering the hospital grounds in a deadly white. The old iron gates were closed and only guards and staff were allowed in and out. But one night, someone came without leaving a trace at the gate. The report of the nurse on duty that day, a woman named Clara Hensley, recorded an unusual event. At 2:37 a.m., I heard the nurse's bell ringing from room 17. I rushed there with a lamp and a key, but when I arrived, I found the door had not been rung. There was no one in the corridor. I felt an unusual coldness. When I looked through the small crack in the door, I saw the patient sitting upright with his face turned toward the wall. But the shadow on the floor was 2 people. Clara insisted that there was a figure standing behind the patient, but in a flash, The figure disappeared, and the patient, as usual, showed no reaction. A few days later, a small note was found under the door of room 17. No one claimed to have left it. It was written in dark blue ink in a handwriting completely different from the nurses or doctors who had worked there. I came because he still remembered me. He still kept his oath. No one can deny what is sealed with blood. I only reminded him that time is running out. The note was given to the head physician Morton, but instead of putting it in his file, he kept it in a separate drawer and never mentioned it again. When he died in 1863, the note was never found again. A year later that night, a strange charcoal drawing appeared in room 17. The drawing, which no one admitted to having done, was carved into the wall behind the bed, a stone gate half open in a mist with a thin figure walking through it. There was no trace of the patient's identity, but the words scrawled below the gate were, "The visitor is the one with the key." I did not invite him, but he came anyway. When asked about the drawing, the nurses denied ever seeing anyone enter the room with drawing materials, and the patient was never given any material that could have been used to create a drawing. The second recorded appearance of a visitor was not until 1859. This time, 2 nurses claimed to have seen a man in a long grey coat walking down the corridor of the East Ward, where only room 17 was occupied. As they pursued, the man disappeared around a corner of the corridor, leaving behind a strange scent, like damp ashes mixed with rotten wood. The head nurse then forced the night shift to work in pairs. But despite increased security, the visitor was never seen again in plain sight, except in the personal notebook of a nurse named Ruth Dallinger. In Ruth's notebook, she wrote, "I believe it was his father or brother. They had the same gait, the same quiet air. But the visitor always wore a hood and he never looked up when he entered the room. It was as if they communicated by a kind of meaningful silence. I was standing behind the door one night when he came. There was no sound of footsteps, no sound of a lock being unlocked. But I knew he had come in, and he whispered something, not to me, but perhaps to the room itself. Have you kept your name?" The patient in room 17 never responded verbally. But after that night, another phenomenon began. Every morning, the nurses changing shifts would find scattered words written on the wall in dust. Dust from the brick, to be exact, as if written with a fingernail or a thin steel barb. The words were always short, incomplete fragments. The arm did not return. The name fell off at the edge of the water. He came in without knocking. When wiped away, another line would appear the next day. And the phenomenon stopped only once the day the visitor was caught by someone he had not expected, a young intern named Edwin Lynch. There's a strange truth about secrets. They don't just want to be kept. They want to be buried. And sometimes they demand to be burned. On the afternoon of June 17th, 1894, shortly after the sudden death of Reverend Landor, who had recorded the baptisms of 3 spinsters in 1831, his niece, Clara Landor, found an old wooden box hidden in his chimney. The box had no lock, but on the lid, faintly engraved, were the words "Nolit ignorare," do not ignore. Inside were letters, all neatly folded and numbered. None of the names mentioned had ever appeared in any parish records, but each letter was like a confession, a whisper from ghosts who knew too much, People think the curse begins with blood, but no, it begins with names. When you name the impossible, it is allowed to exist. Keep the names out of the light or the darkness will claim its own justice. Letter number 3 mentions a name, Margaret Elsbeth, born under the black moon. The name also matches a death record from the area in 1806. A woman is said to have burned herself to death with her 3 daughters. However, a note in the margin of the letter reads, "They are not children. They are names reborn from other blood. Do not let them live again." Clara is starting to panic, but she dares not give up. The remaining letters mention symbols she saw drawn in charcoal in the church basement. Intertwined circles, symmetrical spirals, and upside-down letters. She realizes that the spinsters may not be victims, but keepers of the seal. They were chosen, not by society, but by some much older force. And their job is to seal away things that shouldn't exist. But then, letter 9 causes a complete confusion. We made a mistake. The child should not have been kept. She saw what was in the ashes. She remembered. Who is her A survivor? Or a person with reborn memories? Fast forward to 1904. A huge fire destroys the entire ground floor of the old church in Lexington. Clara has left town by then without saying goodbye. No one knows where she went. But a few weeks later, in a small town near the Indiana border, a woman named Elsa C. checks into a convent and carries a small charred wooden box beside her. When asked why she never married, Elsa just smiled sadly. "A person like me is not allowed to call anyone a husband. I swore it from the moment I was born. You see? There are secrets that cannot be kept in books. They hide in memories, hide in names, burn in unsent letters. But no matter how many times they are burned, they always come back. The question is, who will read them again?" Snow was falling lightly on the road leading into the Troving Forest. Mrs. Margaret Cordain, the woman who lived at the old forest guard station, reported that she heard slow footsteps passing her house around midnight. She got up, lit the oil lamp, opened the door, and looked out. No one was there. But the footsteps still echoed clearly, as if someone was dragging their feet not in the snow, but in the air. The next morning, Mrs. Cordain found a small piece of paper pinned to the door of the house with a pin as black as coal. On the paper was only one line. "They never left. They just learned to be quieter than we are." The paper was waterproof with no trace of ink despite the snow and wind the night before. Cordain took it to the local police, but they shook their heads, saying she was haunted by old legends about the Troving Forest being the place where unknown children were taken and never returned. However, something strange was discovered. The handwriting on the paper matched that of Nurse L. Addington, one of the women who disappeared in 1892 at Winslow Hospital. This caused the case, which had been closed since 1899, to be reopened for a short time. But just 3 weeks later, all documents and investigative reports about Winslow Hospital disappeared from the local archives again. This time, forever. Only one person had a personal copy: Harold Embrick, the Danvers town librarian. "We were able to contact him," he said. Just one sentence. "And those who touch the truth about Winslow will dream of a hallway with no doors. You will hear your name being called, but never see who is calling." The ruins of the northern hill still remained a barren patch of land where no one dared to set foot after dusk. The villagers had placed a few wooden signs around the area where Martha's house had been. No entrance, sacred ground. But no one really believed that wood and nails could stop whatever had come out of the ground. After a makeshift funeral for what was left of Martha, a few half-burned objects, a piece of clothing, and a smoke-stained ivory comb, the Reverend Mrs. Holling never left the farm. She lived in the old main house, occasionally stopping by the hill, placing wildflowers on the dry ground. She never spoke of that night, never wrote another entry in the logbook. When asked, she simply shook her head. The following winter, a traveler came by the village with an old map from the 19th century. He found something suspicious, the spot marked Hollow Field. Martha's homestead was not where the farm had been built. On the map, the land was drawn in thick black ink with no name and no road leading to it. Under the purple light of the ultraviolet lamp, a faint line appeared at the bottom of the map. Names will be taken. They will not remember. They will not leave. The map was lost the next day, and the ledger, the cracked leather book that Martha always kept with her, was gone. No one could find it in the ashes, even though it was an ordinary, indestructible object. Some people reported seeing a strange man in the village. A few weeks after the incident, his face smeared like melted wax, holding something that looked like a leather-bound book with a brass clasp. He passed 3 houses, just looking, not speaking. The next morning, all 3 families packed up and left the village without leaving any explanation. The villagers gradually withdrew. By early 1903, there were only 6 families left. Then 4, then 2. Finally, only Mrs. Holling remained. And one night, as the rain poured down, the light in the parsonage went out. They say that if you go to Hollow Field in October, just before the frost settles over the fields, you can hear something. Not wind, not insects, but the reading of names. Fragile, slow. From somewhere very deep, very old. And if you stay too long, you can feel your hands dry, tingling as if the skin is preparing to register something. A name may be yours or someone you've forgotten. We usually think of memories as something to be kept. But for people like Martha Hollow, memories are just an offering, a form of transaction. You give away a part of yourself to receive something not of this world. Thank you for listening to this strange story all night long. If you're still awake, take a look at your notebook. Who knows, a name may have been written there when you weren't looking. Good night, and dream dreams without a voice calling your name from the dark.